All right, welcome. Glad you guys are here. Welcome to Tuesday Night Theologetics. We're going to cover apologetics tonight. It's going to be fun. Going to catch us up a couple announcements before I begin and we pray and all that stuff. So the podcast that we were filming is out. So you can go on, it'll be on everything. So it'll be, what's the word, synchronized or whatever it's called. There's a word, syndicated. It'll be on everything. It'll be on like all the things, the stuff. But for right now, it's on YouTube, and so on Friday, it should be on everything. But if you go on YouTube, it's called A Lot of Words, and the and lot is 2 words, right? Just so we know, a lot is not A-L-O-T, it's A space L-O-T. I saw you roll your eyes. It's true, though, right? No, we forget that. So it's A Lot of Words podcast. The first 2 episodes we just launched, I'm excited about it. I think it looks fun and good and what have you, but definitely go check it out. Give it a thumbs up or whatever, or what do they say? Smash that subscribe button, whatever you want to say. But definitely go to that. And then we've done a lot of filming, but we're excited to keep doing that. If you have questions and you think subjects you want us to talk about, just email Pastor Brett at brett@barabbas.com, and we'll try to get to that in the podcast. But I'm excited for that. And then my book, the Mere Membership book, is finished. We are in the final sort of physical copy edit type things. We're getting a couple author copies, hopefully this Friday, to look at and check over. I'm excited. The book is short. It'll be about under 100 pages, so it's going to be a short book, but it's a little bit dense, but I'm really excited about that. So it's called Mere Membership, and that'll be out sometime in the next few weeks where you'll be able to purchase that. And so we're doing it, it's going to be on Amazon, so you'll be able to get Kindle, or you can do the hard copy book sent to you, so it'll be like that. And so I'm excited to see that you guys like that. The book's primarily written to pastors or people that are like with it theologically, but you guys are with it. So even though you're not all pastors, you can read it. So it'll be good for you guys. So I'd be honored if you guys got a copy of that and let me know what you think. But Mere Membership, it's really about how the communion table is the visible picture of the local church. And really it is the place where membership of a local church is visibly seen. And we might take for granted we know that, but it's not really how people often think of communion, not out of malice, but it's a health thing in the church. I think it's great. So definitely check that out, and that means I'm back on my project to try to finish the Genesis commentary, and my goal is to get that done in the next few months. And so we'll see what's happening. It's a lot of big things. We're finishing 2 Thessalonians it'll take 3 more weeks to finish Thessalonians, then it's into Deuteronomy. So those are all the initial updates I have. But again, check the podcast out. I'd be excited if you guys liked it and you just kind of gave it feedback and all that stuff. And when the book comes out, even if you don't read it, just read it, but then read it and then get a review or something. That'd be pretty awesome, because this is all self-published. The goal is to make it and just get it out there. So let me say a prayer and we'll jump into tonight. So God, thanks so much for tonight. Thank you that you give me this ability to do this. I'm so thankful for our church, and I just can't believe what you let me do. And so as we go to this subject tonight, help us to have clarity, and I just pray that it is exciting. In Jesus' name, amen. So the stuff we're talking about tonight, I've mentioned like kind of culturally why it's going to be relevant, but one of the subjects that I think is more relevant than we realize is artificial intelligence. Now, why am I beginning with this? The book that we're covering, God's Undertaker, is about how science and God and faith interact, and it's, again, a book written back in 2007 as a response to Richard Dawkins' 2006 book, The God Delusion, and so we're going back to it again because I do think the culture will swing back to these kinds of discussions, not just because the paganism is dead, not just because the Marxism is going to be dying, that we're at the peak Marxist moment, it's going to go back. That's what I've been saying. You guys all with me? I've said it 15 times. You all with me on that? Some head nods here. Okay. There's another reason. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, especially in the church, you're going to see, and you're seeing it already, a ton of articles written sort of decrying sort of artificial intelligence. So you'll have on the one hand technologists, people like Elon Musk. There's a guy at Davos, which was sort of the big global leadership financial summit thing. They had some guy there saying that in a few years, AI is going to take over all pastors and religion. It's going to take over religion. And then you have articles written from a lot of people I even like and would consider people that are definitely like peers with me and people on the same side of a lot of issues as me, arguing on the opposite, saying we got to watch out for AI because it's demonic or it's not good. What I want to say at the beginning and why it's relevant to tonight is I want to kind of whet your appetite slightly. So artificial intelligence, we have to recognize there was a show they used to have, and it's an older show. I talked about it a long time ago, but it's called Person of Interest. Anyone know the show I'm talking about? Who knows what I'm talking about? Raise your hand if you know the show Person of Interest. Raise high so I can see, just a few of you. So Person of Interest was a show with Jim Caviezel in it, And the idea was they had some kind of machine that had so much data, it could predict what someone's going to do with a crime or something. And then it would give him a phone call. He would get like a number of their like social security or their license number. And he would just know a crime is coming, essentially a predictor of crime. That's the premise of the show. But as time went on, you realize this machine was so powerful, it could predict the future. And also, people realized that they would start to worship this machine because it was like a knowledge machine. And people would give sacrifice to it. And there actually happened to be another machine. And there was sort of a religious war between both people and their gods. And so this show, Person of Interest, really was fascinating. Now, I loved the show at first and then hated it very quickly once I saw where they were going. And there's a reason for that. So when we think about AI, when we think about this, the premise of the show, they always had these books on like laying out that was trying to give you hints of what they were doing, which was a little ham-handed. But they'd be at the desk and there'd be a book, The Ghost in the Machine and stuff. And if you know what this is all about, it's kind of fascinating. But in the show that they did well is this idea is if we have enough data, right? If we have enough data and computing power, you can predict the future. That's what the show is premising. Not only the future of what might happen in the world, but the future of what someone will do. And there's some degree of evidence that, yes, there are things we tend to do, and yes, there's patterns, but this machine in the show was absolutely predictive, and it gave knowledge. And what they were premising is that with enough data and enough computing power, you essentially have sentience. It's the same idea behind Skynet. You know, it's the same idea behind what Elon Musk and what this one guy at Davos said is that eventually these machines will be worshipful. And I think that the mistake in the technologists, the mistake in the show wasn't technology and science fiction. It was basic first-year philosophy. And what they don't understand is that the debate about AI has a debate that existed all the way back in Greece, and it was encapsulated in a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. And in that painting, you have Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down. And the debate was between particulars and universals, all right? And you're like, I don't know what we're talking about, Matt. Just trust me. Universals are big concept ideas. When we think of mind, that's a universal. But when you think of stuff, matter, the small things, computation, that's the stuff of everyday, like, you know, little bits and pieces and bobs and mathematical equations. And if you have enough of the small things, you can get to the big things. And the problem with Aristotle, we're going to talk about tonight, is that reduction, basically going down to the smallest component parts, is helpful when you start from the top, but it's terribly unhelpful when you start from the bottom. And what I mean by that is that's what AI is doing. And it's similar to what Leonardo, not DiCaprio, but Da Vinci was trying to do with his mathematical equations. He was trying to find a theory of everything, a TOE, not a TOE, but a theory of everything. That one mathematical equation from the bottom, just taking bits and data from math, could present something that goes up and explains. And you're like, Matt, I'm already lost. It's okay. Person of interest. You can follow this. So sentient machines, and so AI. So most of us think when we go to AI that we're actually interacting with something that's getting eerily human-like. And the problem with that view is that we forget what AI is as a language learning model, let's say. Now, there might be another name for it. It might change a bit, but that's the basic idea. What AI is doing is it's using words and it's mirroring back to you the questions you ask using data points. And the problem that we forget is that in AI, it never has a reason to ask the question. In other words, let's say I was talking to Pastor Brett, and he said there's this one program called Claude thing that you can use for your business, which will actually tell you when you should do things. And he's like, that seems pretty sentient, right? The problem with that is he actually had to sign up for Claude. He actually had to ask it to do those things. What never happened was some random AI from somewhere just decided to start telling him what to do, and then he'd listen. And even if that happened, it would be because someone had programmed it to do that. The thing we keep smuggling into AI is sentience, but that sentience never comes from the bottom. It always comes from the programming. It always comes from the questioner themselves. And so one of the ways when we go to AI, the mistake we make today is that we give it authority. If you ask it a question, it gives you an answer. It's not that the answer is bad, because they could say, well, no, are you telling me the gathered intelligence of the entire humanity and all that data isn't reliable? And then the mistake we make is say, no, it's because there's humanity. Like, it's the wrong argument. The argument isn't that the data exists. The argument is what we're asking it to do. And so when you're with AI and you ask it a question, the way you prompt the question, the humanity you get, is being a mirror reflected back to you. In fact, the biggest challenge with AI that we forget is that AI has no authority outside of you. And that's why we love it, and that's why one day we will worship it. I just don't think it will happen until we're gone. What I mean by that is AI will never take over sentience. It cannot philosophically do so because it doesn't have mind. And so the same thing we talked about last week, if you forget what I talked about last week, how do you go from matter to mind, is the same thing this week, but in a different way. The problem with going from matter to mind, going from rocks to consciousness, is the same problem with AI. No matter how much data you get, all you could do is mimic minds, but you can't create it. not ultimately. Everything we create is in our image. So think about what an idol is. An idol would be, and Jeremiah talks about it, Isaiah talks about it. God says a man takes a piece of wood and he cuts it down and he uses some of it to warm himself by the fire. With some of it, he makes a weapon and whatever. And then with the rest of it, he makes an idol and bows down to it. And the argument is to show you the stupidity of idolatry, but it's also to show us something else. All idolatry, all of it, is always a worship of self. Every idol we make is a God made in our image in one way or another, and we love to worship that God. In other words, we make a God in our image, give it authority so that we can ultimately worship ourselves, feeling like we're getting authority from some transient being. And AI is the perfect realm for that. Now, is AI a great tool? Absolutely, if it knows its lane. And so science is a wonderful thing when it's in its lane. And so AI will never stop being a good tool. You don't need to fear it. It's not demonic. The problem is we often are. And so that's what every time you go to AI, separate, here's a little tip as I'm talking about it, remind yourself that AI is more of a mirror than any other thing. And mirrors can be very helpful when you want to look at that mirror to see what's wrong or see if you like your outfit. If you have an idea and you want to pressure test it, you want to find the data, and it's a great mirror. And you say to yourself, well, no, it disagrees with me. I'm like, does it though? If it says something wrong, think about the question you could ask. How do I take my annoying friend and make them understand, oh, notice it's not questioning your values, whether your friend's annoying. It's actually answering as if your friend's actually annoying. It's always taking your side. It's always seeing things from your perspective. Every answer, it's why we like it. And so when we see it as a mirror, we recognize there's a tool for it. There's a reason for it. But the thing that gives it personhood is you, your mind, or the programmer, never the AI. That problem that I'm saying right now might sound abstract. Keep that in mind. Let's get to this chapter. Chapter 3 is all about reductionism, okay? Reductionism. In any debate about science and religion, sooner or later, the question of God of the gaps will be raised. The God of the gaps is basically the idea that we only refer to God when we don't know things, right? We say, oh, well, why does this happen here? We say, well, there's elves that secretly move elf on the shelf in the middle of the night, right? And you're like, oh, no, it's not elves, it's this. So we come up with a God of the gaps. And the argument behind it is we get more and more data, there's less and less room for God. That's the argument. And this is the idea that when you say that, we say, oh, I believe in God and I do science. They think, well, you believe in science, but there's some party that's intellectually lazy. And we talked about last week the analogy of Mr. Ford and the car. And you could say, it'd be possible if you go to like a pagan place that's never seen a car, that there's actually a person or a god inside that car making it move called Mr. Ford. And you could immediately open up the engine and start to show them Mr. Ford is not in the car. Look, and the more you understand about the car and how it works, the more you can say Mr. Ford's not in the car. But none of that would preclude the fact that Mr. Ford made the car. In fact, the more you learn about it, the more it makes sense that there was a Mr. Ford who made the car. And so this category error we keep making with how we understand science and God, AI and humanity and sentience is it's not something that you make because you're dumb. It's society is making it. Like, again, the guy at Davos, the technologists that are saying these things, they're making a basic philosophical, stupid statement because they don't know basic philosophy. And again, we'll return to the School of Athens in a minute. Philosopher Richard Swinburne, in his book, Is There a God?, says, note that I'm not postulating a God of the gaps, a God merely to explain the things that science has not yet explained. I'm postulating a God to explain why science explains. I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. The very success of science in showing us how deeply ordered the natural world is provides strong grounds for believing that there's an even deeper cause for that order. So what Swinburne is using is inference to the best explanation and saying that God is the best explanation for the explanatory power of science. What happens is when we give science authority without recognizing, so I'll give you an example. When we say, well, science is good science, is unbiased, and we would say that's true. And then I would come across and say, but people are biased. They say, yes, but scientific methodological reductionism and naturalism protects us from our bias. And I'm like, yes, at the mechanical level, but not at the level of deciding what questions to ask, just like with ChatGPT. In other words, you say to yourself, well, that's not biased at all. I'm like, how do you get grants? The grants that you get to do the science work you do are the people that allow you to ask the questions you're asking. And by the way, that's not science. That's political. That's worldview. That's religious in nature often. And so whatever the money is like getting to let you explore in the questions you're asking. So is the methodology unbiased? Yes, absolutely. Are the things that led you to the methodology unbiased? Absolutely not. And to look at this part mechanically as unbiased and then to assume that this is dumb. It's something we miss that. And so we have to recognize that the human element is always there, not just in the data, but in the kinds of questions we're asking. But more importantly, what we know about God and this idea that there must be a God for science to even be intelligible. What do we mean here in this? If, for example, when it thunders, or let me go back a step, the point to grasp here is that because God is not an alternative to science as an explanation, he's not to be understood merely as a God of the gaps. What do I mean? God's not a God of the gaps as like of another explanation for things. God is the ground of all explanation. It is in his existence which gives rise to the very possibility of explanation, scientific or otherwise. What do I mean? And I'm going to say some stuff tonight that it's really important. Don't raise your hand, but I can see your head nod. How many of you already feel like you're a little bit maybe out of your depth a tiny bit? You're like, this is a little bit confusing to me. Anybody? Or you're all with me? Okay. Thank you for those of you. I feel like the guy that says everyone's head bowed. Yes, I see you. The reason I say this is don't stress if you don't get what I'm saying. One of the best ways to learn from what I'm doing on Tuesday nights, just as an aside, what I'm doing tonight, if I sound hard to understand, there's two things going on. One, maybe it's because I am. Maybe I'm bad at this. But I'm not. Maybe you're an idiot. Well, you're not. I think what's going on is I think in these terms, in these categories, and it's a native language for me. And so it's like if I go to Mexico to speak Spanish, like I can speak Spanish right now to someone teaching me, like, ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? But you get to Mexico and like, más lento, por favor. Like, I can't do it now. Because I might know the grammar, but it's not good enough for me to keep up with the conversation. And I think when it comes to these philosophical concepts, if you already start finding yourself losing it, it's not because you're not smart. And I mean this at the depth of my soul. Like the epistemology of teaching is something, I don't often say this, but I want to make sure you don't miss it. The biggest problem with us is not that we're not intelligent or we're not logical or we don't have a good mind. It's that we haven't taken the time to have a good language immersion to get to know the terms where it gets better. And the best way to do that is not at the grammar stage where you go back and learn your ABCs. The fastest way to teach someone a language is to immerse them in the language, not to go to a classroom and learn grammar. Now, you could do that. It helps you, but grammar is helpful when you already kind of know the language a little bit. The easiest way to learn the language is immersion. That's why babies and kids learn language so much better. For us, it's the same. So if you're not sure you get what I'm saying, just let it wash over you. Let hear the words, become familiar with them. And as you hear them more and more, you'll start to get the terminology, the language will get better, and it'll all just snap into place. And you'll realize, oh, he's been saying the same thing. Oh, I get it. It's basic. But for now, if you're not there, there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. The goal for you in those moments is to get comfortable hearing the words and the language. You're learning more than you realize, but that immersion will pay off. You guys all with me? You guys all follow what I'm saying? That truth, what I'm saying, people don't do it because it takes courage. It takes courage for me to believe that you guys are intelligent enough to stick with it and that I'm like going to be faithful enough to like stay steady that you're actually going to learn something. But it matters. And so I'm just so tired of remedialness everywhere we go in the church. You guys are smarter than you give yourselves credit for. And so just let this wash over you. Anyways, back to my scheduled programming. It's important to stress this because influential authors, like we mentioned, Richard Dawkins, will insist on conceiving of God as an explanatory alternative to science. In other words, it's an idea that is nowhere to be found in any theological reflection of any depth. Nobody's saying that. Dawkins is therefore what's called tilting at a windmill. He's dismissing a concept of God that none of us really actually have. And such activity is not necessarily to be regarded as a mark of intellectual sophistication. He's setting up a straw man. No person believes what he says, and then he argues against it, knocks it down, and claims victory. We need, however, to probe a little more thoroughly the claim made by many scientists that atheism, philosophically, is a necessary presupposition for true science to be carried out. In other words, don't let God in at all. You need to have that to do science. They think that any move to bring God in as an explanation of the universe at any level will prove to be the end of science. If, for example, when it thunders, we suppose, like some of the ancients did, that it must be God who's actually making the noise, then we would not and could not investigate the mechanism behind the noise, which is, again, that happened like even in Eastern philosophy. If God was if we're in the circle. In fact, all right, if you're confused already, plug your ears for this part. But there's this whole thing that we come back to about God and the whole thing. It goes back to sort of the circle issue that some people believe that if we're in the circle, if God's in the circle, if everything's part of God, that's what's called oneism. And so everything becomes God. It leads to pantheism, pan-everythingism, but it also leads to like crazy things in physics. So the entire multiverse is premised on the idea that God is part of the multiverse. And so they'll say things like Schrodinger's cat we've mentioned before, which the idea is that if there's a cat in this box, if it comes out and you see it, well, and it's alive, then that cat is now alive. But if in another possibility, the cat is dead, but you didn't see that possibility, then, so the idea is that as long as you don't see the cat, it's neither dead or alive, because on whatever possibility it could be, that the actual act of observing something sort of makes it true, and you're like, this is getting confusing. What they're basically saying is you, the observer, are part of the data. And we say to ourselves, well, you are part of the data. That sounds so smart. I'm like, pause. We say that in science right now, especially in physics, because we don't recognize that there is a universe of things of which there's a God who's outside of those things to observe them. And since we deny that to God, we now deny it to ourselves, which leads us to Schrodinger's cat and the multiverse and everyone is Spider-Man. Back to this. That it's relevant. I need a venue to speak like this, and I'm not some drunk guy at a bar, so I'm here talking to you guys, and it makes sense, okay? But again, this idea of thunder is the idea of putting God inside every mechanism. He's the cause of everything. He's literally Mr. Ford in the engine, right? But only by assuming that, so that we couldn't investigate, but by assuming that there are no gods, we can be free to investigate the mechanism of nature in a truly scientific manner. But if you introduce gods at any stage, and science then stops, because God for them is a science stopper. But again, that's why I mentioned physics. So we say we don't want God in anything because there can't be any God, it just has to be science, but now there can't be us in that thing, so now we're part of the data. Now you've got Schrodinger's cat. So we can certainly need to remove deifications of nature in order to be free to study nature, absolutely. So when we say, I want to get rid of God in scientific mechanisms as well, what do I mean? Well, that means this is like happened all the way back with the ancient Greeks were trying to do this, right? This guy, Greek natural philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, that's a name, and Anaximenes of Malaysia over 2,500 years ago, they weren't content with mythological explanations, such as those written down by Homer and the others in 700. They sought explanations in terms of natural progresses. And this went on to Xenophanes and Colophon and some of these other guys. But the basic idea, there's a guy, an influential Greek Thomas philosopher, Epicurus, born in 341 BC, just after the death of Plato, and we're going to talk about him a bit, who gave his name to the Epicurean philosophy. He wished to remove the myths from explanation in order to improve understanding. So if you have a watch, this is a mechanical watch, and so that means there's little gears. And I can say, why does this watch move? Can I say, well, it works because of God? Is that true? Yeah. God is the ultimate cause of everything. He's the primary cause of everything, ultimately, the unmoved mover. But there's a mechanism in here. Do I think God's in there actually pushing the gears? No. Because I believe that God made a universe. So the watchmaker can make a watch and the watch can run, but the watchmaker still exists. Well, so that's kind of when we get rid of the mythology, we're saying there's not a little elf in here turning the gears. There's not like a guy like in Fraggles Rock. Gosh, these are old now. How many of you have heard of Fraggles Rock before? Oh, okay. How many of you heard of He-Man? Hope so, because it's coming out again. And the actor needed to take a lot more steroids. It does not look like he's big enough for this film. But regardless, this idea here, what he said is this. Thunderbolts can be produced in several different ways. Just to be sure, the myths are kept out of it, and they'll be kept out of it if one follows rightly the appearance and takes them as signs of what is unobservable. So, in other words, he's denunciating these gods together with the determination to investigate natural processes, and that's great. And this is what science is, and I agree with it, and every Christian agrees with that. But notice, that's not actually the debate. That's what they're framing the debate as. When they say that you believe in a God of the apps, they think that when we do science, we're like, that molecule moves because God's pushing it. And nobody believes that. And then they could say, see, there's no room for God in science. It's the most idiotic bait and switch ever. But here's the problem they're also missing. You don't need the Greeks to demythologize science. Moses already talked about this, the idea of worshiping other gods, bowing down to them or to the sun or the moon or the stars. And again, Jeremiah wrote, again, denouncing the absurdity of deifying nature. But what you're missing is, when all of the pagan gods, the gods they're made in our image, but they're also in the system. They're not out of it. They're part of time. Zeus interacts with Aphrodite, who they go against this person, and this person goes against, and he's jealous of that. And there's time and interaction. But God, the one we believe in, exists outside of time and space. Before these things, he's not in those things. Every pagan view of God is lesser, even in that view. And that idea is biblical. And so at this point, you could easily make the mistake of jumping to the conclusion that if you get rid of gods, it's the same as getting rid of God. And that's not the case. For Moses and the prophets, it was absurd to bow down to the little bits of the universe, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, as gods. But they regard it as equally absurd not to believe in and bow down to the creator God who made the universe and them. In other words, Psalm 19 says, the sky, like the heavens declare the glory of God. Let me rephrase it. Everything you look at in creation declares the glory of the one who made it. When you look at a painting or you look at a construction of something or you look at something like tangibly hard to make, it points to the glory of the person who made it, even when we don't know who that person is. So the pyramids, nobody thinks the pyramids just happen naturally to pop up from the ground. What do we say? Atheists will say it must be aliens. Why? Because something in that shape had to be made by aliens? We're like, right, and yet you'd think that people just popped out of goo to you via the zoo. It's the stupidest thing that you could ever imagine. And here's the idea that we have to recognize is to be noted that we're not introducing a radically novel idea. They didn't have to have their universe deified like the Greeks did for the simple reason that they never believed in the gods of the pagans in the first place. What saved them from that superstition was their belief in the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth. And let me say this again. They believed in Genesis 1 that God exists outside of his creation. God is not the tree. We are not all part of God. God made us, and we are not God. That's the key. He is distinct from his creation. And by the way, this basic point is also the thing that makes the scientist distinct from his experiment. Now, can we have bias? Absolutely. But the data itself, we're not part of that data ultimately. And if we are, then why would you know it? And how do you know your data? It takes away rationality, but I'll get to that in a second. This basically, the idea that we're talking about here, the impression is often gained from the fact that most books on science start with the ancient Greeks and emphasize the importance of the de-deification of the universe, but they never quite point out the fact that the Hebrews, way back ancient Hebrews, had already done that. They just ignore that. And so they try to make a mythology. They're telling you that ancient pagans had the views of God, but the Greeks got rid of them, and now we have science. They're so stupid. It's so reductionist. And if someone tells that to you as the thing, they should lose credibility with you. I don't care who they are. It serves to obscure the fact that polytheism arguably constitutes a perversion of any original belief in the one creator God. And it was this perversion that needed to be corrected by recovering, not jettisoning belief in the creator. In other words, going back to the idea that there's a creator is what allows science to go forward. But we have to talk about Thomas Aquinas for a minute. You're like, I don't know who these people are. Don't worry about it. You'll get it later. Thomas Aquinas is a guy who's in the 13th century, and he's very relevant to our discussion. He regarded God as the first cause, the ultimate cause of all things. And this is a really important argument. I've kind of alluded to it the last few weeks. When someone says, oh, you believe that God made everything? Well, who made God? The question itself shows ignorance. I'm not saying that things have to, so in science, we know that every effect has a cause. And so when we say, well, the universe is an effect and had a cause, which is God, and they say, well, then what caused God? We're like, nothing. He's the uncaused cause. And I say, well, how could you stop there? I'm like, you tried to stop there with science. At some point, whatever the prime cause of everything is what we call God. That's the prime thing. And it's not an arbitrary stop. That cause of things has to exist outside of time and space. Remember I talked about Hubble and things growing and expanding? Whoever made everything had to exist before time and space, which means whatever being that is, without looking at the Bible at all, just looking at Hubble telescope, realizing that if the universe is expanding, if you go backwards, then everything, time, space, and all that started, which means whoever started those things, if that's all in effect, had to be outside of time, outside of space, had to be totally omnipotent in some way, organized enough to do these things. You can posit all those things, without actually knowing the Bible, just from observation in a telescope. It's just a fascinating work. But what Thomas Aquinas is getting to is that God was the first cause of all things. Now, you say to yourself, well, I don't know if I like that. Well, guess what? The debate isn't what he's saying. The debate is who that God is. For the evolutionists, the naturalists, the materialists, that God, they'll say, is nature with a capital N. Nature is the cause of all things. Well, nature finds a way, as Malcolm said in Jurassic Park. Nature does it. The debate isn't whether there's an ultimate cause, which is God. The question is, what is that ultimate cause? Who is the God that you worship? God directly caused the universe to exist, and it was thus dependent on him. So here's the two terms so you can remember them. God is what's called a necessary being, and everything else is now contingent upon him. And so the argument isn't that everything that exists has a cause. That's not true, because then you say, well, God exists. Doesn't he have a cause? That's not the thing. It's actually everything that begins to exist has a cause. God never began to exist. He is. He's the I am. There's no time where he didn't exist. There's no such thing as time outside of God. He's the creator, the sustainer of all things. And this is necessary for us to do science, and we'll explain. God directly caused the universe to exist, and it was thus dependent on him, and this is what we might call direct causation. But Aquinas held there was a secondary level of causation, and this is where science exists. Causation, and this is what operates in the universe. And this is really important. This consisted of the cause and effect web that spun out of the vast interlocking, interdependent system that is the universe. And our laziness to not understand this is shown when we talk about God's sovereignty. When we say, oh, you believe God's sovereign, so then why do anything? I'm like, okay, God is ultimately sovereign over everything, but his sovereignty includes our actions, and we truly do them as real actors. In other words, we really do actually affect things in time and space with a real effect. We just know that God planned those things to happen. But he's not the only actor. In other words, we're not just Barbies. He's moving us around like robots. We have a real will that's really free, that's also compatible with his will. It's really free to accomplish his purposes, which are really good. A lot of data. But the fact that this explanation of secondary causation can be given in terms of laws and mechanisms that don't imply the non-existence of a creator, it's just talking about the creation he made. Again, you could study how the machine works and see that the reason that the combustion engine fires in the piston is because you have a spark that comes from this. The reason that doesn't blow up is that you have oil that keeps it moving and so on and so forth. And you say, okay, I can see the cause of why that is. For example, when you use a mechanical watch that's automatic, you don't put oil into your watch. You know how it keeps moving without getting enough friction, which slows it down, is that you use the most frictionless material you can find, which are usually jewels, diamonds, jewels in it. And so when you look at an expensive watch, you say, how many jewels are in that watch? And that tells you how much complex the mechanism is so they can rub without getting friction. You say, I see the cause, and I can see the effect. I can see why it moves. I see now why you use jewels inside the watch, on the outside of the watch. Wow, I can study this. I can open up. I can look at it. None of that implies there wasn't a guy that made it or put them there. In fact, just the opposite. The notion that belief in a creator God who created and upholds the universe would bring science to an end is absolutely fallacious. It's just the opposite, right? Believing that the engine of the car, like we just talked about. Okay, but it's crucial. If we came to superstitiously believe that Mr. Ford was the engine, then we couldn't do science. If we were positing that God is the reason for everything that does, then getting rid of God would allow us to do science. No Christian believes that at all. The key issue here is this. There's a great difference between God and the gods, between a God who is the creator and a God who is the universe. Do you see the difference there? As James Clerk Maxwell well knew, when he had inscribed over the door of the famous Cavendish Physics Laboratory in Cambridge, he inscribed the words over that, "Great are the works of the Lord, they are pondered by all who delight in them." And that's really, when you do science, the best science should be worship. I'm gonna say that again, the best science should be worship. You're learning and dissecting the creation. The best biologist should be doing worship when he does his biology. You're looking at the structures that God made. They're glorious. There's a reason. But here's the thing. The motivation to even look in the first place is because you know it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be organized. There's going to be a reason for the things you see, which really gives us a motivation to look in the first place. But let's see this. Perhaps there's a subtle danger today that in their desire to eliminate the concept of creator completely, some scientists and philosophers have been led, maybe unwittingly, to re-deify the universe by endowing matter and energy with deified powers. That they can't show those to possess them. Again, I keep using the word nature because it's a great example. In the story of the evolution, abiogenesis, the idea that everything came from, the process, when they say, well, how do you decide which one's good? Instead of just saying survival of the fittest, when you say, well, yeah, but what if they all die? Like they say, well, nature finds a way. And they use these words that keep deifying nature. And they keep capitalizing nature with a capital N. There's no data for this. We just keep smuggling in deity to the things. The cell does it. We keep using words like organization. I tell a story all the time, but one of my classes, we were studying the human body. I was a Christian at the time, so this was when I was a personal trainer. I had some medical exercise class thing, and the guy was talking about the design of the spine, the human spine. They look how the spine is designed so well. And I said, can I pause? You believe it's designed? And he goes, well, no. I'm just using that word because we don't have another word to describe it. I'm like, well, I believe that it's designed. I'm a Christian, but I assume you don't believe that? He goes, no. I'm like, could you use another word then? Because this is confusing to me. I just don't want you to borrow my terminology if that's okay. And I was friends with the people in the class. They were rolling their eyes. They weren't Christians. And he goes, okay, fine. He says, the clear organization. I'm like, Excuse me, you can't use that word either. Those are all active words that describe intelligence and purpose, and you believe in a purposelessness. He goes, well, there is a purpose in these things. By whom? Well, he goes, well, nature. Who's that? What do you mean, who's that? Nature's a, like, as you describe it, is this a God with a capital N? And he's like, we can talk about this later. I'm like, okay, if you'd like. It didn't go well. I'm not saying that's the best way to speak to people. But anyways, as we get back to this, understanding the history of this, I think if you look at the history of science, we have every reason to be grateful for brilliant thinkers who took a brave step of sort of questioning the mythological view. Think about how hard it is to live in a tribe that says, oh, the thunder is that like because of Zeus. You say, no, I think it's this other mechanism. We should appreciate that. That's the idea. But again, we should also recognize that the concept right now, the irony right now, is by trying to get rid of God outside of everything, you end up deifying everything as God. And that's what's happening all the time. Banishing the one creator God would end up with what has been described as the ultimate in polytheism, a universe in which every particle has godlike capacities. And that's essentially what I just said before about oneism and twoism. It's pan-everythingism. And that's the idea. When we discuss the limits of science above, we point out that there were certain questions that science was not geared to answer. And here's why this is so helpful. If you're starting to get lost, let me snap us back to reality. There are things that AI is terrible at. AI cannot tell you if something is like why, like what if it's good. It can tell you if you could frame the question, say based on the God of the Bible, does this seem good? It can tell you what it thinks, but you had to prompt that. You can't get meaning from that just from it telling you from nowhere. Like what you ask matters. The way you prompt matters. Like you have to prompt it by itself. It can't do that. Even then, if you just say, tell me how I should act in this situation. You know, my aunt says this and their friend says this. And you start saying it and say, well, it gives me wisdom for the collective people. I'm like, yeah, but notice you just framed it. You said your aunt was like, you framed your aunt as being selfish. You framed yourself as being heroic and altruistic. You did this. So the data you got from all human wisdom is skewed towards an experiment that's not even real. In other words, your fictional reality, you just made objective and got an objective answer that you think is now authoritative, and you gave it the authority of deity. Shame on you. You forgot the lane. This is a language learning model. You know what it's really good at? Is taking your arguments, seeing them in a mirror, and then dissecting them or strengthening them. It's a mirror, and mirrors can help you put on makeup, and they can help you take stuff out of your teeth. But mirror, mirror on the wall is not going to tell you if you're the fairest of them all. And that's what we often want AI to do, isn't it? And that's what people are asking science to do. And so this is kind of what I'm getting to right now. This is profoundly good. I'm excited about my analogies. But the object of explaining something to give is important, but what happens is we do this thing called methodological reductionism. And so the basic argument, I don't want to run out of too much time here, is that if you take things and you break it down to its smallest parts, you can understand things. So I mentioned an engine. Let's do that. I know nothing about cars, so forgive me. But if you want to understand an engine, would it help if I started with a carburetor? And I said, here's a carburetor, lesson 1. And I say, okay, and here is, like the specs in the inline for the rotary girder. And you're like, oh, that's from Tommy Boy, I think. Checking the specs in the inline for the rotary girder. That's not a thing in a car. But you don't know that because you don't know anything about cars either. And so if I just gave you pieces of the car, and let's start with these pieces and study them, let's come to truth from that, how the engine works. It's a bad way to understand it. In fact, we make this mistake in a lot of subjects. We do this in the church all the time. We think you're getting deep because you do a word study. Don't do a word study until you know the shelving that you're going to put stuff on. You don't even know why you would choose what you choose in a word study. You're not going deep until you know the language that you're in. Like, that's not depth. Just like you're not learning about an engine by spending all your time really getting into the bits of a carburetor, telling me all the bits of it. Reductionism is helpful when you start at the top, and you can reduce things down to its component part, because then you have a reason for the things you're looking at. You have a shelving for why these things are important. You know which level to do things. But reductionism takes a true point that looking at things in their smallest parts helps us to explain big things. But it says, well, if we start at the bottom, we can explain everything. And so this is the idea, like for example, in mathematics, right? We can use mathematics to reduce and compress big complex phenomena into short and elegant equations. And so if you're a real math nerd, equations become beautiful. Now, for most of us, they're not beautiful, but it's the guy on the board writing symbols. You're like, that's beautiful. But think of the phenomenal achievements of guys like Kepler and the rest, where they take many different observations and they compress them into a single statement that planets move in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus. There's a lot of different data points, and you say this point, now I can conceptually understand how those are relevant, what they do. This is true for Newton. This is true for Maxwell, for Einstein, for Schrodinger's, for all these other people. They're taking big concepts, and they break them down into smaller bits, and then they can make statements. It's great. Great mathematician David Hilbert, spurred on by the singular achievement of mathematical compression, thought that the reductionist program of mathematics could be carried out to such an extent that in the end, all of mathematics could be compressed into a collection of formal statements in a finite set of symbols, together with a finite set of axioms and rules of inference. Let me explain what he's saying. It was basically a seductive thought that if you have enough data accounted for in the equation, you would have an equation that explains everything. That's what I was saying before, the theory of everything, the TOE. Right? It was a seductive thought. It was the ultimate bottom-up explanation as a glittering prize. And mathematics, if Hilbert's program were to succeed, would henceforth be reduced to a set of written marks that could be manipulated according to prescribed rules without any attention being paid to applications that would give significance to those marks. In particular, the truth or falsity of any given string of symbols would be decided by an algorithm. You just measure it by the symbol, and it would tell us if it was true or false. It was the ultimate measuring rod. And so the hunt was on to find or to solve the so-called, and I'm going to say it wrong, problem. It's this word I can't say. And so the idea was to find the general decision procedure, okay? And so experience suggested to Hilbert and others that this problem would be solved in a positive manner. Just to relate again, when someone says to you, when Elon Musk says, well, one day machines will tell us all the things we want to do, it makes sense. If you get more and more intelligent machines, they'll get faster and faster, the answers will get better and better, but they make a jump in categories. More data, like, and here's an analogy I'll give you. If I say to you, if you can study how to make bricks, you can have a building. Well, it doesn't matter. If you gave me more bricks, you still don't have a building. You never have a building. You need a plan to have a building. But if you just start with bricks, you never get a building. And say, what if I give you more bricks? Still don't have a building. What if I gave you all the bricks, the best bricks, the fastest bricks? I had bricks that made bricks. Great, you still don't have a building. You need a plan to have a building. Do you understand the particulars never make universals? You can never get to universals from particulars, nor would you ever understand why you would want to in the first place. And that's the issue. And so this is what they're trying to start with mathematical equations, you get to meaning. Starting with data, starting with apples, you're going to get to meaning. What's the meaning of life? 47. Well, it doesn't make sense. So there's a guy named, an Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel, or how do I say it? Gödel? Okay, you guys, whatever. I ask you so you know I'm not trying to say I know the names. You don't need to correct me later. I don't know. But Kurt Gödel published a paper entitled On Formally Undecidable Propositions of Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. Have fun. His paper was only 25 pages long. My book's 80. Just saying. Just kidding. But it caused the mathematical equivalent of an earthquake whose reverberations are still palatable today. And it's really awesome. For he had actually proved that Hilbert's program was actually totally doomed and could never make sense. In a piece of mathematics that stands today as an intellectual tour de force of first magnitude, Gödel demonstrated that the arithmetic with which we're all familiar is incomplete. That is, in any system that has a finite set of axioms and rules of inference and which is large enough to contain ordinary arithmetic, there are always true statements of the system that cannot be proved on the basis of those axioms and those rules of inference. This result is known as Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. In other words, you can never account for the questions you're asking in the first place, the things that you're assuming this is saying. Those are all intangibles, this is where AI is so interesting. He proved that one of the statements that can't be proved in a sufficiently strong formal system is the consistency of the system itself. So if I say to you, heads or tails, and I flip the coin, and I say, I'm going to get heads this many times and tails this many times, the whole issue of Malcolm in Jurassic Park says, what if it doesn't land, or what if it lands on its side? When you say, well, how do I know the sun? How can science prove to me that the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Oh, it doesn't come up, Matt, actually, technically. Okay, let's just use a language, the phenomenological language for a minute. How do you know the sun's going to come up tomorrow? Is it scientifically reasonable to assume that the sun will rise tomorrow? Is it something we can rely upon, you think? Yeah, we have to. And yet, do you know that's going to be the case? We actually don't know that it will actually rise tomorrow in theory. We're not in the future. And so to say that it does, in fact, scientists, I saw an article today, just came out to believe that we're not actually in a computer simulation. I'm like, well, good for you. The basic argument, he has been succinctly summarized by saying that if a religion is something whose foundations are based on faith, then mathematics is the only religion that can prove it's a religion. I think that's a phenomenal statement. But anyways, in informal terms, as the British-born American physicist and mathematician Freeman Dyson put it, Gödel proved that in mathematics, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, there's a limit to reductionism. There's a limit to AI. It has a lane, and it's good in that lane. But don't miss this. As an aside, AI is a great one-world religion. And I think people will try to make it one. Not because it's actually deified, but because it's a mirror. It tells us what we want, and that's what every God does. And there's no God more fit to tell us what we want than AI. Anyways, back to my scheduled program. Peter Atkins' statement, therefore, cited earlier that the only grounds for supposing that reductionism will fail are pessimism in the minds of scientists and the fear in the minds of religious is actually just totally incorrect, like scientifically incorrect. These guys are making these big statements, are actually going against settled, very researched, very settled science that says this is actually categorically not a possible thing. And they say, oh, the only people who disbelieve that is pessimists. That is the most blind faith religious statement that you can make, truly, actually, measurably so. Studying all parts of a watch separately won't necessarily enable you to grasp the complete watch's work. So this is kind of what we're getting to. It's epistemological reductionism. And again, it's the view that higher level phenomena can be explained by the processes at a lower level. And it's just not true, right? It's the idea of, again, we keep saying going from matter to mind, matter to mind. And so we talked about the brick lane, but another one is DNA. And this is where I have to give myself like 2 minutes to discuss it. I've discussed it before, but let me do it again. Like, you could talk about language, but I'll use DNA as language. It's the same thing. When I start with component parts, if you study letters on a piece of paper, like I write you a letter, and this is helpful because DNA is the same thing. DNA is not ones and twos or ones and zeros. It's like an alphabet. If I write you a letter that has paragraphs and all that stuff, and you study it, and you break it down, and you start getting down to like how much ink is in each line. And you get down to like the weight of the ink and the GSM of the paper and the pulp of how much paper is in each spot and how dark certain parts of the ink. The more data you have, you don't have information of what the letter says because there's no information contained in those letters. None whatsoever. Not materially speaking, those letters are exactly what you're studying, ink on a page. The information in those letters is never in the letters. You don't download it, you can't touch it, you can't measure it. There's no information in the letters. There's simply symbols. The information is in my mind, giving those symbols meaning, and that another mind can then read, but the information never comes from the letters. There's no measurable thing. It's not like there's no downloading piece in your head. I have a mind, I see symbols, and another mind can read those symbols. That's the point. Studying the letters, you'll never learn a language by just studying like, what's the word? You can't get a vocabulary merely from phonetics or the grammar of language from its vocabulary. You just can't do it. And so the same thing is with DNA. You could study DNA and say DNA says this, but it doesn't mean that DNA information, it has to have a reader somewhere. It's like a letter on a page. There has to be a mind. Again, buildings don't emerge from bricks and so on and so forth. And so this is called information theory. It's one of my favorite things. I just don't want to get into it too much. But what happens is people talk about methodological reductionism, which has value, and they put it into what's called ontological reductionism. And ontological basically is related to the same thing, but here's what it looks like. Richard Dawkins says it this way. He says, the universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Now, the problem in his statement, listen to it again. I'm going to say it one more time. This is one of my favorite things that Lennox does. He says the universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Notice the word nothing but sole and simply are the telltale signatures of what's called ontological reductionist thinking. In other words, if you remove those words, you're left with something that's actually unobjectable. Objectionable, right? The universe certainly is a collection of atoms, and human beings do propagate DNA. Both these statements are statements of science. But once you add the words, it's nothing but those things, and it's solely these things, you're no longer doing science. You're now going beyond science and making an expression of belief, naturalistic materialism. You're inserting a worldview. You're saying it's only those things. That is not science at all, and that's the problem. The question is, it said the statements. Without those things, it would be true, but it wouldn't be interesting. No one would be like, that's amazing. The interesting part of what Dawkins says that everyone likes is the word nothing and solely and only. because that's the telltale thing, and that's not science at all. He's hiding the ball. He's using science to dress up his religion based on nothing and selling it as sophisticated, and you should call him out. And so again, we can go on, but let me just get to my paper, because I wrote a paper. It's on our website under this teaching on the app. And again, I said a lot of things here, a lot of words. Go to the A Lot of Words podcast. I'm just kidding. But you can read this over and over again. And my point to you is if you're misunderstanding it, take pieces of this. I'll give you a tip. This is where AI is really good. Here's data. I'm giving you a lot of arguments. If you're not sure what I'm saying tonight, try this tonight. Take this paper and take one paragraph and put it in the AI and say, explain this to me like I'm in 5th grade. And do that with each one. And then say, explain the whole thing like I'm in 5th grade. Once it explains it, reread it. And then if you do that, send me a note how it went. I'd love to know if it was helpful. Like, AI is great for that. But here's my paper. I want to call it the School of Athens for this reason. So, from matter to mind or from mind to matter, modern thought is dominated by a single, mostly unquestionable assumption. Mind emerges from matter. Given enough time, enough particles, enough complexity, consciousness appears. Thought is a late arriving byproduct. Meaning is an evolutionary illusion. Rationality is merely chemistry that happens to be useful. This assumption governs the academy. When you say academy, that means like higher learning. It governs the sciences, and increasingly, it governs the imagination of the modern world. You say it does? I'm like, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, all the cartoons we watch are cartoons and hero stories about the multiverse. We have our little Zeuses and Captain Americas, and now that's the multiverse Captain America. This is a multiverse, but those are like questions of worldview that are at the popular level. And this governs these things. And it's not merely mistaken belief, it's a self-destructive belief. Because the moment you say that matter precedes mind, you've already undermined the very mind making the claim. So that movie, that show, Person of Interest, if they say that this machine can predict everything, when they deify the machine, it is a mirror. And what does it do? It means that we're all merely machines, absolutely predictable, because we're really just a set of data points that this thing can interpret. So by deifying the machine, what does it do? It reduces us. And so because their view of God is too low, their view of man has to be too low as a corollary. But anyways, Plato, Aristotle, and the fork in the road. This is where the School of Athens begins. This is what I'm talking about. The fracture begins with where Western philosophy forked. And the reason I'm bringing this up is this is not a small issue. It is the fundamental issue of ancient philosophy. And so for people to make the mistake means we're just uneducated in this. Plato argued that universals, for our sake today, say mind, are real and prior. Things like truth, goodness, meaning, rationality. These are not constructed from below. They're recognized. The mind does not invent them. It responds to them. It sees them. On this view, the world is intelligible because it participates in a higher rational order. Aristotle, on the other hand, turned order around. Universals, he said, are just abstractions, things we made up, drawn from particulars. We observe enough instances of form concepts. Meaning rises from matter, and intellect follows substance. You get enough bricks, you do get a building. That's what Aristotle's point is. The philosophical divide is captured visually in one of the most famous paintings in Western history. Tell me if you've heard of it. It's called The School of Athens, painted by Raphael, not the Ninja Turtle, but the painter. Who's heard of the School of Athens? Anyone? Go Google it. If you're right now and you're on your phone, go ahead and look it up. Google School of Athens by Raphael. At the center of the fresco stand Plato and Aristotle. They're like walking through a city. Plato's hand is pointing upward toward the realm of forms, ultimate, right? Toward what is above, prior, explanatory, toward mind, toward God. Aristotle's hand points downward toward the earth, toward particulars, toward what can be observed, measured, and classified. The gestures are not artistic flourish, they're philosophical claims. Plato's raised hand asks, what must be true above for anything below to make sense? Aristotle's lowered hand says, stay with what is below, meaning will come from there. That moment is the transition. That direction is determining everything, because once explanation is sought entirely from below, once the arrow points downward, mind becomes secondary and eventually unnecessary. And Schaeffer traces this out in others. But modern materialism, Dawkins, and even the way we view AI is simply Aristotle without breaks. What do I mean? This is where Leonardo da Vinci becomes emblematic, not as a villain, but as a transitional figure. Leonardo believed again, not the Ninja Turtle. Leonardo believed the universe could be fully understood through mathematics and measurement. We covered this. And reality, he thought, was written in numerical language. And if we could just describe matter precisely enough, everything else would follow, including meaning. And that dream never died, even though it never materialized. Leonardo never achieved it. He really gave up on it, but the dream never died. It matured into modern scientific imagination. Today, it goes by names like neuroscience, cognitive science, and theory of everything. The hope is that the mind will eventually be explained away as a sufficiently complex arrangement of matter. That eventually you have a brain that gives the illusion of a mind. What we're witnessing today with AI, artificial intelligence, is not a departure from this, but it's its latest expression. The hope remains the same, that if we scale particulars far enough, data, correlations, computational power, meaning will finally emerge. But AI does not begin with mind, it begins with data shaped by human design. Any universals it appears to generate are not discovered realities, but borrowed frameworks imposed by programmers, objectives, and constraints, or the questioner themselves. In other words, when you're with AI, you're the only mind in existence, but there is data, and the data is very helpful if you know its lane. But in this sense, AI in the purest form is an explanation from below, and it's an Aristotelian project without any teleology, without any purpose, and it has no universals or grounding. It has patterns, but no meaning. And the irony is striking. Having rejected transcendence, some now flirt with granting AI quasi-divine authority, not because it possesses a mind, but because it reflects our mind and our desire for control and worship of self. It gives us the feeling of objectivity that follows our subjectivity. This isn't the rise of a new God, it's the old temptation resurfacing. Again, a mirror mistaken as a mind. But here the absurdity emerges. AI describes relationships. It does not generate meaning. Equations model reality. They do not interpret reality. A language learning program does not know what it means. It does not intend. It does not truly reason from itself. It reasons from you. It's very helpful for that. You can map the brain endlessly. You can test your logic endlessly. You can develop your language endlessly. You can give AI more and more data and computing power, but you'll never find a mind, ever. And we say, no, if enough bricks, you can have a building. Bricks don't make buildings. Here, the reductionist project collapses under its own weight. Like I said, words on a page do not carry ideas materially. The ink has no intention. Paper has no awareness. The same sentence can be printed, erased, translated, or spoken, and the idea remains unchanged. Why? Because information is not a material property. Information presupposes that there's a mind that encodes, a mind to decode, a shared rational framework to communicate. Matter can transmit the symbols, but only a mind can mean them. So when someone claims the mind is just the brain, they've already borrowed what they deny. They're using reason to argue that reason is an illusion. They're trusting thought to tell them thought cannot be trusted, which is not courage, it's incoherence. Here's the thing, but Genesis gets it right. Scripture begins exactly where reductionism fails. And God said it was so. Genesis does not begin with matter, it begins with mind. Genesis presents reality as intelligible because it was spoken into existence from God. Creation is not accidental motion, it's intentional communication. History is not an endless series of cycles, it's a linear progression toward a linear purpose. Matter exists because meaning precedes it. Order exists because reason precedes it. And here's the thing, science is possible because mind is foundational. And here's the decisive reversal. In modernity, matter has to become mind or the illusion of mind, but in Scripture, mind has to come before matter. And here's the thing, that is actually the world we live in. And this is why the study of matter presupposes the mind at every step. Observation assumes rationality, and measurement assumes order, and interpretation assumes meaning. And it's, again, the reason why quantum physics is more philosophy than it is physics in so many ways. To study matter while denying mind is to deny the very mind reading the data. The mind following this argument cannot exist on reductionist terms. This explains the modern university system, and this is why we're all so dumb, myself included. As universals disappear, disciplines fragment. At higher learning, you end up going into more and more specialized fields. You go into smaller and smaller disciplines that don't communicate with other disciplines. We say we're going to get deeper and deeper into studying this one aspect with no bridge to other aspects. We've lost the generalization, the theology, which is the queen of it all, the philosophy, queen of it all. As universals disappear, disciplines fragment. Each field retreats into narrower particulars. Physics no longer speaks to philosophy. Biology refuses metaphysics. Ethics is severed from ontology, and meaning is dismissed as unscientific. There is no integration because there's no longer a reason to integrate. And the result is not humility, but confusion. It's not knowledge, it's absolute mere accumulation of data. And the academy, and if you have a PhD, I'm not trying to be rude to you, I'm not saying you're dumb, but you're definitely not a generalist. The one thing you say about PhDs is they know less about more things and more about few things. But I'm being mean. At the end of the day, I'll be meaner. The academy has become a towering structure of expertise with no foundation. And without the Lord, it's a literal tower of fools, no offense. But Scripture's diagnosis still stands from Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to take and do something with data. Not only of wisdom, but of science itself, because only if reality begins with mind can matter be examined with meaning. So let me get to us now. Francis Schaeffer, who I keep referring to, is one of my favorite guys on this, and he says this, or we're talking about this, reduction isn't merely false, it's unlivable. If humans are machines, then thoughts are chemical events, not truths. And morality is just conditioning, not obligation. And meaning is preference, not reality. Maybe there's another society somewhere where murder is great and love is bad. Like, oh, really? So Schaeffer didn't merely debate, and nor should we. I'm not advocating that you go out and sound like me talking to your friends at somewhere. They're going to think you're weird. Schaeffer pressed people to live their worldview, and I do the same. So when you're with someone, they tell you, well, I think this. Like, well, so why do you trust your reason? Why do you protest injustice? Why do you insist on dignity? And why do you argue at all? The goal is to help someone truly feel the rocks of reality that reductionism denies. I want to help them see that they love as if persons matter, and they reason as if truth exists, and they demand justice as if right and wrong are actual things. And their revolt against their own system exposes the unlivability of their system. It reveals the lie, the unlivability of the things that they're saying. Here's the argument reduced to its essence. You cannot use your mind to deny that a mind exists. You cannot use words to say that words have no meaning. You say to myself, Matt, I would never do that. Again, let me refer to you back to Rosenberg. I forget his first name. Again, one of the top atheistic philosophers back in like the early 2000s, who wrote an entire book telling us that your mind doesn't exist and that words are not real, using words in a book to explain it to people with minds. And he's taken seriously. You cannot study matter without meaning. And you cannot argue against reason without borrowing reason. Reductionism collapses because it explains everything except the explainer. And Christianity doesn't ask us to abandon thought. It explains why thoughts work at all. In other words, listen to me carefully. Christian, our job is not to defend our faith as if it's on the stand. What do I mean by that? Every person you meet, an atheist, a Muslim, a Jehovah's Witness, a witch, they live in this world. Every one of them, this is the real world. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Like, as a Christian, you're not a Christian because you like Coke more than Pepsi. Everyone you meet, no matter what they believe, lived in this world because this is what it says. This is true. So when you meet someone that says, oh, I believe these other things, you're not saying, oh, yeah, let me explain why my belief is true. They're saying that they're flying through the air as an elephant. Like, your job isn't to defend your view. They need to defend theirs. In other words, our job isn't to defend our faith as if it's on the stand. Our faith is reality. If it's not, let's not believe it anymore. But we have to, Christian, absolutely be confident in challenging the false faith, the false presuppositions of the unbeliever in front of us. They need to account for their presuppositions that they just hold to, and we let them off the hook too often. And so what do we confront them with? Not just that deconstruction, but the truth that Jesus, the Jesus of this book, is the only way, the only truth, and the only life. And that's our argument. That's what apologetics does. It begins by deconstructing their views so that they can finally see the necessity of these. Let me pray. God, thank you so much for tonight. I ask that you would use it. I'm excited to see what you do as people translate my words into better words. Praise you in Jesus' name. See you next week.